Well, thank you very much to the panel for those introductory remarks. I'd now like to invite members of the audience to come to the microphone and ask your questions. While you're screwing up your courage to do that, I'll just make a couple of remarks. I heard a lot of issues emerge from the various perspectives of the stakeholders, including access in the community, options for patients with aggressive cancers, the need for better surrogates, outcomes, and data sharing, the notion that one size does not fit all in terms of the development paradigm, and that we're kind of living between two epochs in terms of the kinds of drugs that are being developed. The way to use and leverage the emergence of health apps and wearable technology, how to use data from sources other than traditional clinical trials, and so on. So a question I guess I would just throw out to kind of get us going is how do we incentivize our partners, such as those that you represent in the community? How do we incentivize patients to participate in a new paradigm that that might be much more inclusive? And I say that in light of what we heard about the moonshot also, where we have some new questions and we're trying to engage a larger fraction of the cancer community in some of these efforts. How do we create those incentives?
So I'll start with one of our favorite topics currently at FDA. So right now there are over 20 PD-1, PD-L1 products that are either approved or in development. And we had a recent meeting with some renal cell experts at FDA where we talked about how there are 5 first-line trials with PD-1, PD-L1 products in combination with a small molecule or something else, all versus sunitinib in first-line metastatic. And it involved over 5,000 patients total in these 5 trials from the different companies, all of whom had a control of sunitinib. And we've talked about it a lot in public that we think common control designs would be useful both for incentivizing patients to enter the trials, because every patient's fear is, I'm going to get the worst product, which, maybe the patient doesn't have equipoise, which is fair because they may not be as educated about the product. But if we gave them more of a chance to get something that may be more promising, we could incentivize patients to come into the trials. Plus, we don't have enough patients for all of these trials. And not every patient should be getting sunitinib in a one-to-one randomized basis. So that's one thing we've been trying to encourage companies to do from the FDA side. And one thing we've tried to do to reassure companies about this is that we wouldn't ask for comparisons between the test arms. It would be all statistical analyses to compare themselves to the common control only. And that there shouldn't be, for reassurance, there shouldn't be comparisons among the other arms, because we think that may be one way to encourage companies to enter into this kind of trial. So that's something we've been talking about a lot.
So let me pick up the gauntlet on that point. Certainly, if you were doing a single trial, you might not wish to put an equal number of individuals on a sunitinib control arm as you would on immunotherapy in a common framework with multiple treatment arms. Other than a common control that sort of lives in outside of all of the trials, or maybe lives only within a single one, does FDA have any leverage in terms of getting the companies to collaborate in a more traditional structure that would make that common control arm concurrent? Is there any leverage or device that FDA has to make that study look more conventional? That's really the question.
So the short answer is no. I mean, our legislative authority is to evaluate safety and efficacy. So we don't have a lot of tools to say to companies, you must participate in something. That we can provide as many inducements to them as possible, but in short, we don't have anything that could make a company participate in a program like that.
But isn't there clearly an advantage to saying, you only have to accrue, one control and 3 experimental, your arm can be 3 to 1. I mean, wouldn't people jump on that? So, Eric?
Well, no, so first of all, I think it's a great example, but I think the issue, or it's the lack of control, right? I mean, companies like to pick the sites, they like to make sure they've got the best quality data. I think this, in some sense, you're removing that control. I mean, there might be issues with trial design, power calculations. They might not agree with, the overall approach. But I think it's something that should be worked on. It may happen. There may be cases where it happens automatically just because you can't do it. I mean, maybe you can get away with it in renal cell. I don't know, but there may be other diseases where there's just no way you could have 5 randomized trials going on at the same time.
Okay, let's take a question at the center mic.
Mary Tobin, Acres. I've been working with the feds for a long time now, 30 years, and I love you guys dearly, but one of the problems that I've noticed has to do with outreach and communication. Almost everything we've heard over the last 2 days has to do with sharing, collaboration, working together. And when I was working on the MedWatch program, which, as you note, no one knows about, I actually went to all of the physicians that I could find and said, "Do you use MedWatch?" And they said, "What?" I don't think it's that much different now. And if you were at the 8th annual meeting for the Sentinel last year, they said, "What's our biggest problem?" Nobody knows about us. How can the federal government, whether it's CMS, FDA, anyone, improve their outreach?
Well, I can only speak for the office which I represent, which is we try to provide outreach at every opportunity. We meet with groups who propose a meeting structure within the agency. We go to every professional society and have meetings with both advocacy groups and with international regulators and basically anyone who wants to meet with us. So we as an office are out there as much as possible. However, we are not all the FDA. We are not Sentinel. We can talk about Sentinel at all these outreach meetings, but we can't be everything. So, I mean, we try. Tell me where else we could go. Tell me what to tell the other offices where they could go.
Well, I know one of the problems with MedWatch was that there's a 160-member MedWatch partner group, and what they were crying for was a 2-way communication process, not just sending questions in or getting some out, but actually having dialogues. And of course, legal stepped in and said, "No, sorry, can't do that." But it's somehow there's a 2-way mechanism that seems to be missing.
So I would say the one thing I can say is certainly with any proprietary information from a company, we can't share it. There's no way we can. So we're prohibited by law. So some of what you may be asking for may not be possible within our current legislative framework.
Well, and obviously I was concerned about this, or I wouldn't have brought it up. And I mean, we're in a new era of social media and apps, and I just think that's what people are going to be used to, and we're just going to have to adapt and get it that way with the proper controls. I actually was working with a physician, and there was a serious AE, and he said, "Well, I'm not going to report it. It's too much work." And the patient said, "Well, I have no idea what I'm going to do." And it was, it was just like, but if it was click my little app, I think the patient would have felt more empowered because the physician was not doing his job in this particular case. And that's what actually brought it to my attention. There's some problems with the apps and things, but you would think the internet would be accessible, but it's not proving to be.
Rich, please.
So I'm going to take the workshop chair's prerogative to challenge the panel. We've been here for a day and a half. We've talked a lot about where we've come from, where we are now, where we would like to go, where we could go. We've heard various descriptions of how the field is evolving and changing and so on. I wonder if we could just go down the row and ask each of you, from your vantage point, to tell us one thing, just one thing, that you would like to see be done differently in the drug development process that would achieve the overarching goal of greater efficiency, greater speed, but preservation of scientific rigor and advancing important new products into clinical practice for the benefit of patients as quickly and effectively as possible. Each of you give us one thing.
Okay, so Dr. Shilsky, that's an appropriate challenge from the workshop chair, and I will help you hold our panel's toes to the fire on that. If we could maybe start with Howard, and we'll just go right down the line. I'll take the sub-chair's prerogative to go last. Howard, you're on the spot.
Okay, well, there's a few things to throw out, but, and well, if we skip these, I'll come back. But I think, one thing that I just think we're at this era where I remember when there was controversies about PET scanning and who to do it 12, 15 years ago, and now everybody gets one and they have an 11th number people get. But I'd like to see us change it to where we and certainly I think with circulating free DNA, we're getting closer to that, but where we facilitate and work with the payers and CMS and the like, that not is it, will we pay for a patient being biopsied and profiled at the time of the recurrence, but is it close to being mandated so that you actually know what you're treating? I think you see patients all the time that come in and they're excited and they've got their CARES or their foundation report, and it's from their ovarian cancer resection 6 years ago, and they've had 5 intervening therapies, and it's almost irrelevant information. So long answer to say, but I think that idea of getting to where we begin to incorporate the molecular profile of what we're currently treating on a patient's cancer into the EMR for use would be of huge value to pharma, huge value as we begin to teach our physicians how to take care of the patients.
Okay, great. Thank you. Lynn?
I know there's so many to choose from, but I think I'm going to go with the real-world evidence. I really think that if we could crack that nut, if we could figure out how to use that information that's out there on patients' experiences, real patients' experiences, that would make a really major difference.
Thank you. Eric?
That one has my vote, too. I think Jeffrey also mentioned, there's just a ton of data that is out there now that isn't being used. And I think, we're beginning to see the tools for where that can be, there's probably still be a lot of noise, but I think where we can get to useful information there that can be used both on the development side and maybe potentially on the, from an approval regulatory perspective as well.
Thank you.
So I was going to say real world evidence too, but since it was taken by the prior two, I will say if I never see a 3+3 design looking for an MTD again, I would be happy. And so I'm going to get really specific that I really, what I want is modeling based, first in human, pharmacodynamically searching or biologically effective dosing based on the science is what I would like to see.
Well, you guys took my answer. I only have one. Yeah, well, it was. I'd really like to find a way to trust the data in the EHR so they can be used within the drug development paradigm, right? Because right now we're collecting data inside the EHR, and then we send nurses around to make sure that it was right, because that's the only thing you can do, right? So it's incredibly expensive to do that, and I'm not sure we're there. I don't know that I would trust the data that are sitting there. So it might be a good place now, but I'd love to see that change.
Thank you. Rebecca?
So we talk about the fact that the trials are homogeneous and that we aren't getting all of the eligibility. We have to expand eligibility, but part of the problem is that we're not getting a lot of people on the trials. I work in a hospital system where there's an underserved inner city hospital, and it's not because the patients don't want to. I mean, these are, average income is under $5,000 a year. It's mostly African American. It's because they can't. because they don't have anybody to take care of the kids, and they don't have a car, and they can't take the bus, and if we could just come up with this to get some of these, it's no longer that I don't trust the system, it's I can't do this, my life is too complicated. If we could get those people on the trials up front and then support it with real world data, I think we would actually get some of the data we need right from the beginning.
Thank you. Ron?
So I'll step outside of my CMS role and into my pediatric oncology role and say it would be nice if we included kids in trials more than we do. Very, very small number of children with cancer, but as some of the medical oncologists were telling me at the break, a lot of what we've discovered in pediatric oncology has informed medical oncology. And so I think there are no ethical problems in putting kids on trials. We do that all the time. I think that's an excuse. And I'd like to see that happen. And you know, how do I put it? I have 2 kids and they mean more to me than my own life. And I think most of us feel the same way. So how as a oncology community do we completely ignore pediatrics in developing new drugs?
And so, Dr. Shilsky, I would add to the list, I would like to see the pipelines that we use for development be designed explicitly for the clinical setting and for the properties of the drugs under study, rather than to reflexively say we need to have a seamless this or seamless that. I'd like to see us take control over the nature of the pipeline and make sure that it will produce the kind of product that we expect. So just to summarize on that point before we go to Dr. Bertagnoli's question, we heard biopsies to know the best therapy longitudinally throughout a patient's history, better access to data, which came up in a couple of ways, both EHR as well as data sharing. Replacing the 3+3 model, yes, thank you for that. And then more participants in trials, including adults, underserved minorities, as well as children, and explicit designs for the pipeline. So, Monica, please.
So it's more of a comment, and then maybe whoever in the panel wants to rebut can do that. You know, this is a drug development workshop. It's about drugs. But what's been alluded to a little bit is drugs aren't the only way we treat patients. And so as a surgeon, and we've heard from the radiation oncology community too, one of the things that we know in our subspecialties is that when drugs change, so does surgery, so does radiation therapy, so do all the other downstream treatments that we provide. So mine is just a plea also for the real world data, which is to include not only drugs and the impact, but the impact of a new drug and a new therapy on everything else we do to treat the patient, because I think that's a really understudied aspect of what we do. And just for a final example, you know, I do a lot of sarcoma surgery. I have lived through the advent of Gleevec, of imatinib for gastrointestinal stromal tumors. I can tell you that my entire sarcoma surgery program was radically transformed by the advent of imatinib. And we've tried for now, almost 15 years that we've had the drug, to study in a careful way what has been the impact of surgery in metastatic disease that is now being controlled by all these tyrosine kinase inhibitors. And we can't do it. You know, we just don't have the tools and the abilities. And there's a lot more than just the drug that goes into treating, you know, particularly solid tumors. So it's just, you know, I'd be interested to know what people in the panel think of the whole rest of the world of treatment.
Monica, I agree with that comment completely. It was interesting as we've wrestled with how to get consent and the patient's data, getting as far up the food chain as possible turned out to be the best move to make. So we're about 1.5 years into that, but having the navigators consent a patient to a broad-based look at their data from when they first get diagnosed. And then you're right, it's been interesting. Once a patient gets to the medical oncology practice, it's almost a different world, but it's been easier to get data and to influence behavior up the food chain, and the surgeon's involvement has been fabulous. I mean, you know, their willingness to be involved, be engaged. So I'm with you. I mean, we're early into that, but I think that absolutely is is going to be the way to go. I think we do too much of it from the bottom of the food chain, which is really the med-onc practice, and that's just where it is. Well, I mean, it's funny. I mean, you know, I'm a medical oncologist, and we're pretty sure the sun rises and sets on us. But, and then I say, well, if you're a medical, you really need a good doctor and a great nurse when you're. But you know, the getting up the food chain, having the surgeons, it's a dangerous thing to empower them and tell them that they're all they think they could be. But that is a key part of a place to get involved.
But you're still too segmented. I mean, you need to think about it from the patient's perspective, so they see all these things.
Right, yeah.
You know, I mean, so that's what needs to bring it all together.
And I agree. I think that navigator is their point of contact as they move from surgeon to rad-onc. But you're right. I mean, I don't want to leave them out. It's just helping them get at the beginning of their journey, not halfway through.
Let's take a question from the middle.
Hi, I'm Suanna Brunigi with ASCO. Good to hear everyone's interest in real-world evidence. My question is, since ASCO and, of course, Flatiron and others are in this space now, are there examples of people from the clinical perspective, you know, the EHR world where a lot of this data is generated, working with the research space to marry these data streams in a logical way? Because I know the research world has been moving, you know, toward electronic case report forms, electronic submissions, et cetera. And to the extent that we could actually marry these two, I know we've tried at ASCO for many years to approach it from the perspective of influencing the EHR companies to try to make the data more appropriate for medical oncology, and quite frankly, that's gone almost nowhere. So I'm curious if there are any influences from the research world on the EHR community to try to improve the data and make it sort of fit for both purposes, if there are examples of that.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, I'm not from the research world, but I'm going to quote Jeff Brown, who said, if CMS says you have to do it, I guess we're all going to have to do it. So in the oncology care model, we went live last week with a data registry where we collect anatomical staging information, relevant molecular mutations, relevant histology, both for payment and outcome. And we say that you have to do that as part of your participation in the oncology care model. And that's how we're actually going to get in the future to bundled payment models are not breast cancer or lung cancer, but are HER2 positive breast cancer stage 4, ALK positive lung cancer, et cetera. So that's one way to do that. I have bruises on my head, scars on my head from beating my head against a wall, trying to find out if there was a common standard among the EHR companies for reporting oncology data. And the answer I got was, no, there isn't, but I guess if CMS says we have to do it a certain way, I guess we just have to do it that way. So we finally came to the conclusion, we felt empowered. We said, well, if that's what they're all telling us, then we're just going to do that. And so we set a standard. We went live last Monday. I don't think the system has crashed yet. You know, it'll get better over time as the EMR companies, work to our standards, and we will go forward with that. So that is at least one small step, hopefully using the power of government for good.
I'll comment. I think it's a good question, and having been on both sides of this, it is sort of odd that these days most medical care, including in patients on a clinical trial at an academic center, you are using some type of electronic version to do that. And what happens on the industry side, of course, is that we have collectors that are also electronic. And so you're in the space of where it's electronic here, and it's electronic over here. Someone, a human, is in between that, actually maybe looking at one screen and then typing in on the other one, which just seems really bizarre. But that's the way it happens. I think there are, Tony Tolcher from START is trying to solve this. I think he's got examples of where he can potentially line up to what the industry wants in terms of the data collection, but I don't think it's widespread.
So I was just going to add, I mean, I agree with Eric's comment. Some of the things that Tony and START have done are interesting and worth looking at. We have, and this has really been driven a little bit up from the data managers through the research nurses to the physicians, and it's crawling from the research patients to regular patients. So if the EMR picks up something that happened that would be a toxicity, the physician has to make an attribution, which it was all about attribution, drug, not drug related, what did you do to handle it? And that was the method on the research side. And now it's been interesting to see with the accrual in the patients that now the other part of the story is even for people not on a study, why did you drop a dose, change the dose, and then did you discontinue therapy for progression, toxicity? And it's pretty rudimentary right now, but it gets to some of those core pieces, particularly the causality attribution piece, I think, could easily be migrated to all the therapies we're given, not just those that are on study. So I think those are a couple examples that might work out.
I'm curious, Dr. Klein, the registry, is that something that is connected in some way to the EMR data, or is it separate entry, and what's the...
We hope, well, it's partially connected. We're using a CDC's CCDA for cancer registries format, and the EMRs are adapted to that, and the hope is that over the 5 years, the model, so part of the data will be collected through a direct export and mapping function from exporting from the EMR using the CCDA format into our data registry. Part of it will be manual entry just because there are no specific fields. And again, we sort of hope over time, as CMS says we're going to collect this information, that the EMR companies will adapt to that and make it more direct export.
Yeah, I think the points you raise are good because both the staging information is, as you said, often not there, but then in response to what Dr. Burris was saying, you know, the attribution and causality, or why, if they discontinued therapy, why? And of course, that's the question you want to know. So it ultimately may be a triangulation of data to really get to, you know, the purpose that we all want the data for. So that's, you know, maybe a good take-home point too. Thanks.
I just want to push back a little bit on this dichotomization between clinical trial data and, quote, real-world data, which I happen not to believe in. I would remind everyone that medicine had about a 2,000-year history of using real-world data and really didn't do all that great until the experimental method came along. So there's something very real about clinical trial data. But on that point, as we start to make other data sources part of the research process, which I think is what everyone is talking about, does this imply that we're going to need changes to HIPAA? No one's talked about HIPAA over the last couple of days. But for example, I heard it said recently at my institution by somebody who had a lot of experience with the real world, that if you walk into a drugstore, that CVS or Walgreens knows before you know, let's assume you're a young woman, knows before you know whether you're pregnant or not by your purchases, and that they track all of that. And when you pick up a prescription and you sign for your prescription at the grocery or drugstore, that is actually a HIPAA waiver. And I don't know how many of you have ever read it, but I read it and I've stopped signing that because it's a HIPAA waiver. And they take your private information and put it in their database, and that's how they know that a young woman is pregnant before she knows by her purchasing power. So anyway, that's a rant. But back to my question, does HIPAA need to be modified if we're going to take advantage of these data sources? Let's put our
This is an easy one, yes.
Yes? Okay.
No.
No? So maybe elaborate a little bit.
Well, not only am I not a doc, cancer researcher, or lawyer, I'll still assert that HIPAA needs to be changed. We spend an awful lot of time getting around the laws. So I'm not getting around the laws. I'm dealing with HIPAA. No one quite knows what we're allowed to do and what we're not allowed to do in terms of sharing. The reason we designed so I'm at the Operations Center for the FDA Sentinel system, and we designed it as a distributed network because we didn't want to move anyone's data around. So we don't move the person-level data around. It would be easier if we had a big database. We don't because of HIPAA. I think it was the right decision. But we are so horrified of doing the wrong thing that there's plenty of work we do that there's plenty of work that we could do that we just don't. And in particular, linking information because there's no single source of information that's actually good enough. So you want to link it, but to link it requires identifiers, and requiring identifiers, it becomes a big mess. I'm standing by my yes. But,
Okay. Rebecca, any particular thoughts?
I mean, it's embarrassing that we have patients signed all these HIPAA waivers that nobody reads them. I mean, you just go in and you just sign and you sign. Who's ever read one of those things or understands it? I just don't think it serves the purpose we wanted. I mean, we have to be careful about how we protect patient data, but let's be really frank. There is no privacy if you're on grid, right? And I think most people, and there are some people who are off grid. I mean, they just go offline because they're worried about that. They live in Montana, right? And they, but like we said yesterday, right? Amazon knows exactly what I'm doing, and they know exactly who I am, and they know exactly what I'm interested in, and their ads show it. So there's no privacy. And in the medical field, we have this artificial law that makes it almost impossible for us to do good things when there is no privacy if you're on grid, right? So I think we have to somehow, and I don't have an answer, we have to somehow modify this law so that it's more realistic and still put up real abilities to allow patients' medical information not to be used by the wrong people, but to be used by the doctors and the researchers and the people who can actually cure diseases and help people.
Do you think that should have been part of the moonshot?
Well, I think Moonshot is got so much going on as it is that I don't know how we would have pulled that off.
Okay. Well, that's a little can of worms anyway. Let's move on and take a couple of questions. We have a few more minutes. Frank, please go ahead.
Frank Rockwell, Duke. You actually answered half of what my comment about the I think false attempted dichotomization between real world data and trials. I think people need to be careful with that. It's not one or the other. You run clinical trials to answer some questions. You look at real world data to answer others. One does not necessarily substitute for the other. And I think that people get seduced by the supposed ease and size, but I think that's a problem. Real world data are actually quite useful to answer real world questions. They may not be useful to answer every clinical. They're not necessarily a replacement, and they're not necessarily less expensive depending on what you want to do. But it get back to really what got me to come up here was Jeff's comment to get the data to a place where you can actually trust it and standardize it. People say, yeah, we should standardize things, but I think to the point, unless you get somebody like CMS or somebody to say, yeah, it isn't going to happen. People aren't going to, do it on their own. And I guess the last comment is, it's easy to get seduced by the size of real world data, but I would remind people an approximate answer to a good question is better than a precise answer to the wrong one. So don't just go someplace because there's a lot of information if it doesn't have the content that can answer your question.
Thank you. Any comments? Yeah.
I want to agree and thank you for that. We often go around saying, look, I have 200 million people and 50 million current lives and billions of rows of data. But you can't use it for everything. And sometimes you're going to actually get just the wrong answer if you try to use it. I guess I'm known back home as the guy who always says no, because the people are trying to use the data for things that are inappropriate. So it's trying to pull back, and it's incredibly important to make that point. You're often attacked by making that point, like you're the only one who knows how to use it. It is very hard to use the data well, particularly these data that are collected for another purpose. We could prove all sorts of things that are both absolutely precise and completely wrong. If you don't know what you're doing, so we really do have to be careful, and I'd like wherever we go, we should be noting that. It's got to be fit for purpose. You really have to know what you're doing.
Thank you. Let's take a question from the middle.
Yes. First of all, I would just want to really reiterate what you said about clinical trials being a way of getting real world data. I mean, people are real, and that it's just a very expensive way of getting real world data on real world patient level data. But what I wanted to throw out is that I've been looking at this for about 2 years now with doing almost nothing else. And the number of problems that can get solved by creating patient-centered repositories of their own information. In other words, not the provider's EMR, not Cerner's or Epic's, but the patient's own EMR. The number of problems that we've been discussing here in the last half an hour or so just disappear. Totally disappear. HIPAA lets the patient get the data into that repository, and that's as far as HIPAA needs to go. From then on, the patient owns and controls it and can make it available to pharma companies, to all kinds of other people for all kinds of other purposes. The solution really is fairly simple. There's a technology problem, and they're challenged, but it's not that hard. Anyway, I just wanted to throw out the idea that there is a solution, and it really is a single patient EMR.
Any comments?
Well, it also served the patient well. Right, and I mean, I don't think I really understand all of the implications you were implying, but certainly there's a patient advantage to that, an ethical advantage, and the patient portal just begins to do it, right? But there's so many things that don't get in the patient portal, and there's the patient's information that they can use.
It's not a patient portal.
Yeah, you're going to create a whole other EMR,
Yeah.
but that's what we have now.
That's right.
Right. And from an ethical standpoint, it's the patient's information, and they need to be empowered to use it and control it. I agree.
Last question. Yeah.
Scott Fogarty from Thermo Fisher Diagnostics. First, I have a comment and then a question. The comment is that we're trying to support this change in paradigm with our next-gen sequencing platform. So you heard Keith Flaherty talk about MassGen with the MATCH study, so we're helping to support them with our Oncomine assay. And then Tehran mentioned about approval and reimbursement. We just filed a PMA with our universal next-gen sequencing assay with Novartis and Pfizer. And my question is, I'm guessing that I might be the only person in the room from the diagnostic industry here. And so I'm wondering if you thought there might be some value with having participation by the diagnostic industry from a stakeholder and paradigm shift perspective.
Comments?
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely.
I think that's all you're going to get, is a universal yes. So please join me in thanking our panelists.